Here is the rewritten version of the script, preserving the original emotional depth, narrative style, length, tone of quiet hope and human connection, and inspirational arc. All promotional calls to action, channel references, and engagement prompts have been removed. The night Caleb Harrison received the call, he was on his knees in the dim kitchen, working a damp cloth over a stubborn purple stain on a thrift store rug while his 6-year-old son slept curled on the sagging couch nearby. The overhead light buzzed and dimmed the way it always did when the ancient heater rattled to life. For a heartbeat he thought the sudden darkness was another overdue notice finally catching up. But it wasn't the power company. It was his phone shivering across the chipped Formica counter. The name lighting up the screen squeezed his ribs tight. Olivia Monroe. The billionaire founder and CEO of Monroe Biotech. The woman whose signature appeared on his biweekly direct deposit. The most formidable person he had ever stood in the same room with. The last person he ever expected to call his personal number. Men like Caleb, widowed, perpetually exhausted, raising a little boy alone in a cramped 2-bedroom walk-up on the east side of Columbus, did not receive late-night calls from women like Olivia Monroe. He almost let it go to voicemail. But some instinct deeper than reason made him swipe to answer. Her voice on the other end was not the polished, iron-edged cadence she deployed in glass-walled boardrooms. It was thin, cracked, almost fragile. She asked only one thing: could he come to her house tonight? She gave an address in Upper Arlington and nothing else, just that quiet plea hanging in the silence like smoke. Caleb glanced at Mason, small chest rising and falling, fingers wrapped around the frayed ear of his stuffed bear. He hesitated only seconds before texting the neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Donnelly, the retired ER nurse who kept an emergency eye on Mason when life demanded it. He told himself this was about the job, about proving reliability, about protecting the thin thread of stability he had managed to weave for his son. Deep down he knew it was something else entirely. The Monroe estate rose against the winter darkness like a modern citadel, sweeping glass, pale stone, iron gates that parted without a sound. Caleb had been inside once before, for a company holiday reception where he spent the evening trying not to spill appetizers on his rented suit. Tonight the long driveway was empty. No cars lined up. No music drifted from the windows. Only the hush of fresh snow and the crunch of his boots. Olivia answered the door herself. No tailored blazer, no carefully applied armor. Just a soft gray sweater, hair tugged into a loose knot, eyes rimmed red and raw. She stepped aside without a word and Caleb crossed the threshold into a space that felt both vast and strangely empty. Marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, but the air held no warmth, no lived-in scent. It was beautiful the way a photograph is beautiful, perfectly composed, perfectly distant. She led him to the living room. Financial printouts and analyst reports lay scattered across a low glass table like fallen leaves. A television flickered silently in the corner, closed caption headlines scrolling, stock slides, shareholder unrest, whispers of a board coup, federal scrutiny closing in. Caleb recognized the hollow expression on her face. He had worn it himself 3 years earlier when doctors in starched coats delivered the news about Hannah's aneurysm. It was the face of someone watching the ground disappear beneath their feet. Monroe Biotech was hemorrhaging. A high-profile clinical trial for a promising autoimmune therapy had collapsed amid safety concerns. Investors were fleeing. The media circled. The board, people Olivia had hand-selected, was quietly positioning to force her resignation. She had started the company 15 years earlier with nothing but inherited debt, a rented lab space in Cincinnati, and a stubborn belief that medicine should not bankrupt the people it was meant to help. Now that belief was being tested in the cruelest way. She dropped onto the sofa and pressed her palms to her eyes. Everyone she trusted, advisors, friends, even family, was urging her to step aside gracefully, to preserve her personal fortune and reputation while she still could. But walking away meant surrendering the mission to people who saw patients as quarterly metrics. It meant admitting the dream had failed. Caleb sat across from her. He did not rush to fill the silence with advice. He simply listened. When she finally lifted her gaze, exhausted, unguarded, she spoke the words that lodged somewhere deep inside him. She said she wasn't afraid of losing the money or the power. She was afraid of facing the wreckage alone. He understood that particular terror better than most. He had stood alone in a fluorescent hospital corridor while machines flatlined. He had sat alone at a kitchen table filling out death certificates and explaining to a 4-year-old why the world had suddenly grown smaller. He knew the shape of that loneliness, how it pressed against the lungs until breathing hurt. He shifted closer, not intrusively, just enough to close the invisible gap between them. He told her, quietly, that she wasn't alone tonight. And for the first time in years, perhaps ever, Olivia Monroe allowed someone to witness her unravel. She cried without apology, without trying to hide the sound. They spent the next hour moving through the documents together. Caleb was no scientist, no Wall Street strategist. He was a project manager who had learned precision from years of making every dollar stretch. He spotted small discrepancies in the data sets, questioned the way certain headlines framed the failure, noticed patterns the high-priced consultants had overlooked in their rush to assign blame. He suggested something simple and radical: stop hiding. Acknowledge the trial collapse publicly. Commission an independent audit. Invite patient advocates, real people whose lives had been touched by earlier Monroe therapies, into the conversation. Let honesty replace spin. Olivia listened. As the clock edged past midnight, her shoulders began to lift. The defeated curve of her spine straightened into something determined. She started making notes, placing calls to her legal team, sketching the outline of a press statement that would own the mistake and recommit to the original purpose. When it was time for him to leave, she walked him to the door. Snow had thickened, blanketing the driveway in soft white. She paused on the threshold. Her voice was calm now, but gentler than he had ever heard it. She told him that in a house filled with pieces worth more than most people's lifetimes, she had never felt truly visible until that evening on the couch beside him. Power had insulated her so completely that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen without agenda. A single father who fought to keep the lights on had reminded her what real strength looked like, not in conquest, but in quiet presence. Then she said the sentence that altered the trajectory of both their lives. She told him she trusted him more than anyone else inside Monroe Biotech. The weeks that followed were punishing. The press conference drew sharp criticism at first, then grudging respect. The independent investigation eventually cleared the company of intentional wrongdoing, the trial failure traced back to a contaminated batch from a third-party supplier. The board vote to oust her was tabled. Capital began creeping back. But the deepest change happened inside Olivia. She started hosting unfiltered town halls with staff. She walked lab floors herself instead of relying on reports. She launched a foundation in Columbus dedicated to supporting families navigating chronic illness, naming it the Hannah Harrison Foundation after hearing Caleb's story. Caleb never asked for anything in return. He expected no reward. Yet one afternoon months later, Olivia summoned him to her corner office with its panoramic view of the Scioto River and the city beyond. She offered him a new position, Director of Community Outreach for the Foundation, a role that would let him ensure patient voices shaped corporate decisions. The salary would allow him and Mason to leave the apartment for a modest house with a fenced yard. When Caleb told Mason about the yard, the boy's eyes filled instantly. Not because of the money, but because he could finally have the dog he had begged for since he could talk. Life did not become flawless. Grief still arrived unannounced for Caleb in empty hours. Responsibility still pressed hard on Olivia's days. But something essential had changed between them. They had both learned that true power is not measured by balance sheets or titles. It is measured by who you choose to stand beside when the world is crumbling. On the day Monroe Biotech broke ground for a new research campus in Cleveland, Olivia stood at the podium beneath bright October sky, microphones catching every word. She spoke of accountability, of resilience, of the people whose lives depended on steady hands and honest hearts. When she called Caleb Harrison forward and thanked him publicly, for showing up on the hardest night, for reminding her why the work mattered, the audience rose in sustained applause. He stood at the edge of the stage holding Mason's small hand, throat tight, vision blurring. Because sometimes the most transformative act is the simplest one, showing up. As the sun dipped below the Columbus skyline that evening, Caleb watched Mason race across their new backyard, laughing at nothing in particular. Inside the house, on a narrow wall beside the kitchen table, hung a small plaque from the Hannah Harrison Foundation. A quiet reminder that love, once given, never fully fades. And somewhere across the city, in an office high above the streets, Olivia Monroe stood at the window and watched the same fading light. She whispered a single thank you, not for the empire she had protected, but for the night a weary father stepped through her door and proved that even the tallest towers rest on ordinary, beating hearts.